All right, in this last section, we're going to be discussing sexual behavior, sexual response, attitudes, and consequences. So, we're going to be going through a whole bunch of really interesting things in this last section. So, first of all, sexual behavior is a really wide scope, and to talk about that, we have to talk about the areas of the body that are used in sexual acts, and these are called erogenous zones. And the definition of that is any area of the body that produces pleasure and can evoke an erotic response. And genitals are probably the area that we think of as being the most common or most prevalent erogenous zone. But if you look kind of more broadly, the mouth, the breasts, ears, anus, and pretty much any surface of the body can be used as an erogenous zone. So think of, people will nuzzle each other on the neck or kiss each other's stomachs. That is part of an erogenous zone. We also have sexual scripts. These are our unspoken mental plans that help guide our sexual behavior. It helps us determine when and where we're likely to express our sexual feelings and with whom, and it helps provide a plot to the order of events within a lovemaking session. So you would know that, after dinner and a movie, then going back to one of their houses, having a drink, and then moving towards a sexual encounter, that would be more common than just jumping on a person when they came into your vehicle. And people's sex drive is also an important aspect of this. So your sex drive is the strength of one's motivation to engage in sexual behavior. Now, it's commonly thought that women have a lower sex drive than men do, but that's actually not the case. It just seems to kind of peak at different times. So men typically have a higher sexual drive in their teens and 20s, whereas women are a little bit later, maybe 20s and 30s. Now, another important part of this is the topic of virginity. So virginity is actually not a physically determined category. So virginity is actually culturally and personally defined. It's not a biological thing. You can't look at an individual or any part of their anatomy to determine if they're a virgin or not. It's obviously defined differently for men and women. So women are traditionally thought of as losing their virginity when their hymen is broken. We'll talk more about the hymen in a minute. But for men, there's not culturally seen as having some sort of defined physical experience or physical change when it comes to losing their virginity. It's also the way that we think of virginity as being lost is typically through vaginal and penile intercourse. This is very heteronormative, so it presumes that there's a man and woman in the sexual encounter and not two women or two men, and doesn't necessarily define the wide scope of sexual behaviors that individuals will have throughout their lifetimes. A lot of couples will say, well, we want to maintain our virginity so we won't have penis in vagina sex, but they'll engage in other sexual behaviors but still define themselves as being virgins. So that's one of the things that helps individuals define what they consider to be virginity. For some people, having any sort of sexual encounter, whether it's oral sex or anal sex, that would maybe break or end their virginity. And so that's one of those personally defined characteristics as well. There's also no way to determine if someone is a virgin by looking at them anatomically. This is actually a misconception. So typically when discussing this, we discuss this when talking about women. We talk about what we call the hymen. This is a very thin piece of mucosal tissue that surrounds or partially covers the external vaginal opening. And in the image here, you can kind of see where the hymen is. So in this individual, this is like a normal hymen. Their hymen is kind of at the end and at the bottom of the vaginal opening. For this person, they have no vaginal opening because the hymen covers the whole thing. This is actually medically very dangerous, and they typically will have to have the procedure to open it up so that vaginal discharge and menstrual fluid can actually leave. So this is actually problematic. But this is kind of what people think of as like the hymen covers the whole vaginal opening until the individual has sex, and that's not the case. Some people have a microperforate hymen, so they have a very tiny little hole, and then the vast majority of the vaginal opening is not available. And then some people have actually kind of two connecting pieces or two holes and a connecting piece kind of in between. So there's different types of hymens. Now, this hymen can be damaged in a variety of different ways that are not just vaginal intercourse. This could be damaged through physical activity such as gymnastics, anything kind of like a rough physical activity, horseback riding being very kind of stereotypical. It can be broken through or stretched through masturbation and use of tampons. And virginity tests that are done in certain cultures are inaccurate and unnecessary, because some women don't even have much of a hymen that can be observed visually or be felt by an observer. And also they may have damaged or stretched it in other ways that don't have to do anything or don't have anything to do with intercourse. Now, it's also like a very the way we describe it is a very violent thing. So we pop a girl's cherry or we take her virginity. It's very, it's very rape culture-esque to talk about like taking something from a woman, or that she is somehow altered permanently by physical, by intercourse. And that's something that I think we as, educated young adults and adults, we need to begin to move away from that terminology. When we look at sexual behavior and arousal, overall, men and women do not differ in their average number of sexual partners. So as you can see here, most individuals will have one partner. Some people, I'm not sure what age they were measuring this, but some people have a little bit more, some people have less, but it's not different male to female. When we look at sexual behaviors and arousal, we also don't see any differences in the sexual activity patterns that men and women engage in. So they're talking here, like the dark green is any opposite sex contact. Vaginal intercourse is the blue. Purple is oral sex. Anal sex is the green, the light green. And same-sex contact is this maroon color. There's also some famous research done by the researchers Masters and Johnson. And they actually were the first people to look at human sexual response back in the 1950s. Masters was actually an obstetrician, and he delivered babies, and he was like, hey, we know that babies, we know a lot about babies and how they're delivered and their prenatal development, but like the whole sex part that leads to babies, we really don't know anything about. So he decided to do some research on this, and as you can imagine, in the 1950s, it was not well received by his workplace and other research institutions. So he got a lot of difficulty in this research, and also just getting people to participate. And then Johnson was his secretary, who became his research assistant, and she was able to kind of help reach out to female participants. And they did a lot of really interesting research relating to the different stages of human sexual response, as well as masturbation and a whole host of other like really internal physical things that no one had ever observed before. So very interesting research and very important for us. So what they discovered is that most people have 4 phases within their sexual response. So the first stage is excitement. These are the initial signs of sexual arousal that then moves into a plateau phase where the physical arousal intensifies but kind of holds steady for a period of time. Then we see orgasm, which is the climax or release of sexual excitement. For men, that's ejaculation, and for women, that's a series of pleasurable muscle responses and usually like tensing. And then we have resolution. This is the return to lower levels of sexual tension and arousal. After that, we have what's called a refractory period, and that's a short time after an orgasm when men are unable to reach orgasm again. So women can have multiple orgasms kind of rapidly in succession, whereas men need a period of time to kind of like relax and reload, recharge before they can go again. So here's an example of like 3 different sexual encounters. So in encounter A, we see the excitement phase here quickly going to plateau, and then orgasm and a potential second orgasm before resolution. For session B, we have kind of plateau that kind of wavers over time, and then resolution without orgasm. It is not a requirement. And then session 3, we see excitement taking a little bit longer, not much of a plateau, and then long sustained orgasm before quick resolution. For men, we have the excitement, plateau, orgasm, and then this potential refractory period where it takes them a little bit of time to kind of recover. And then if there's a secondary orgasm, it's going to take even longer the next time. So they'll have to kind of go down to a lower stage before things can continue. So we look at attitudes towards sexual behavior. I'm sure you've talked about this in history, but there was a sexual revolution. In the 1960s, we saw much more liberalized attitudes towards sexual behaviors, especially when it came to premarital sex or sex outside the marriage. It kind of became less taboo for couples to have sex with other individuals and kind of bring other people into the marriage bed, as they called it. Partly this was increased, this access to sexual activity was increased because of access to effective birth control. So previously, there were condoms and diaphragms and other different sexual contraceptives, but it wasn't super effective, and it was also kind of burdensome for the couples. When the birth control pill became accessible, then women could take control of their fertility on their own through just a daily pill, and it made it much more easy for women to control their fertility and not kind of being reliant on men to use condoms effectively. Now, the interesting thing is that in most states, women actually had to have permission from their husbands in order to get access to the birth control pill. And they had like a permission slip signed before they could take it. But then that became more open. Actually, I think it was like 1970s, the Supreme Court ruled that women could make that choice for themselves. So in the 1960s, we saw much more sexual activity among teenagers, and then that reversed in the 1980s up until present day. And you can probably ask yourself what happened in the 1980s to reverse this trend. Well, of course, it was HIV and AIDS. So once that came along and people understood that heterosexual women could have and contract AIDS and spread AIDS, then it was much less, that free love, have sex with anyone kind of attitude shifted because there was an element of danger. Of course, there were STDs or STIs previous to HIV, but most of them were very easily treatable and curable, or something that wasn't deadly. So, herpes is a virus that is not really, you can't really cure it, but it wasn't something that would kill you. HIV, on the other hand, would lead to AIDS and certainly death at that time period. Of course, now HIV is a manageable condition with medication. Viral loads can be so low that transmission is almost impossible. So there's been a lot of achievement and a lot of increase in access to care for that. But is the sexual revolution over? We do see now that adults will spend as much of their adult lives alone as they do in marriage. Now, this is not saying that they're cohabitating and they're in long-term relationships, they're not having sex, just saying that people are waiting much longer to get married. And so that kind of leads us to understanding that people's sexual behaviors are changing. It used to be thought of that like you didn't have sex until marriage, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But now if you're waiting instead of getting married at age 20, age 30 or 35, people are much more likely to begin having sex kind of in those, adult years. It's actually funny, my English teacher from high school, she got married when she was like 17 or 18. Of course, all of us, ninth graders when I had her, we were all scandalized by this idea. And she told us, she's like, well, our parents told us we couldn't have sex until we got married, so we got married. And that was just kind of what you did in the past. But now people are, understanding that you don't get married so young, but because you're not getting married and having access to that sexual partner through marriage, sexual behaviors outside of marriage have increased. We also see trends in over-sexualizing young girls due to the spread of pornography and other media influences. If you look at, social media, especially like Instagram models, influencers, TikTok dances, they tend to be hypersexualized, and that can lead to young children, especially young girls, kind of behaving in more provocative ways and having other young men kind of have access to that content as well. We also see a double standard still as well, and this double standard here refers to applying different standards of appropriateness to male and female sexual behaviors. This is less prevalent than it was in the past, but it is still there. So if you think about, a man who has multiple partners, you may, think of him as a player or, just a regular guy kind of sowing his wild oats. But if a girl has multiple sexual partners, she's often demonized as being a whore or a slut, and that's considered to be a really negative thing. Now, men may also kind of get some of these monikers, but generally it's kind of more tongue-in-cheek than it is for girls. It's considered to be much more improper for girls to have multiple partners or, have multiple partners kind of simultaneously, dating multiple men, than it is for men to have multiple partners. Of course, internet pornography has increased access. So almost all adults will admit to viewing at least some internet pornography at some point. And public attitudes have become much more accepting than in the past. Sex workers in general have kind of become more acceptable in our culture. So whether it's pornography, people who, perform acts, through live camera streaming, or, sex workers who are actually doing physical sex acts, for payment, it's become a little bit more acceptable to be part of that culture than it has been in the past. Men are more likely to view pornography alone, whereas women are more likely than men to view it with a partner. And then 25% of young men do worry about their porn use, whether it's the content they're viewing or the frequency. Part of the problem with pornography is it falls into the category of what we call a supernormal stimulus. This is any stimulus, often artificial in nature, that's more potent than the natural stimuli than we have evolved to encounter. So when we view pornography, what we see are idealized encounters, and this can cause desensitization to normal sexual encounters. So, the people who are in pornography are often very beautiful, have had plastic surgery, they have makeup and hair, everything's been touched up. They're scripted, they're acting through these sexual acts, and while they are, performing them, they're doing it for the camera angle with the correct lighting and just the correct noises, and that's not how actual sexual encounters occur in real life. So people who view a lot of pornography are oftentimes disappointed with actual sexual encounters because they don't live up to this idealized set of actions that they have in their head. And that's what can cause a lot of problems for people who view pornography very frequently. We also have a series of sexual dysfunctions that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be covering desire disorders, arousal disorders, orgasm disorders, and sexual pain disorders. So to start off, desire disorders, these individuals have either too little or no sexual motivation or desire, or they have too much, so their desire levels are off. Some people have arousal disorders. This is when they desire sexual activity, but they do not become aroused. Some people have orgasm disorders. Some people cannot have orgasms or experience them too late or too soon. And then sexual pain disorders, they experience pain that makes lovemaking uncomfortable or impossible. So when we go under desire disorders, there's different types. We have hypoactive, which is, hypo means under. So that's a diminished desire, and this can happen for both sexes. So they have a loss of desire, and this has to be persistent, and they have to be troubled by it in order for it to be diagnosed. So if a person just doesn't really desire having sex, but for them that's not a big deal, that is not considered to be a sexual desire disorder. That's just, that individual. But if they're bothered by their lack of sexual desire, then that might be problematic and they'd be diagnosed. They may also experience sexual aversion. This could be feeling fear, anxiety, disgust about engaging in sex. It can be caused by a whole host of things, including fatigue, illness, hormonal difficulties, medications. Oftentimes medications like antidepressants or antipsychotics can actually decrease sexual desire, so that can be kind of a side effect. And then some individuals have hypersexual disorder, so they have an excess of sexual desires. They may have intense or recurrent sexual fantasies, urges, and or behaviors, and they can fall into sexual addiction if it's not treated. Arousal disorders include male erectile dysfunction or erectile disorder. You have probably seen the commercials for this if you watch anything relating to like men's sports, golf in particular, I swear. Like every other commercial is for some ED pill. So what this is an inability to maintain an erection during lovemaking. So oftentimes performance demands can be problematic or an overreaction to the temporary loss of an erection. This will generate fears and doubts that then contribute to a further inhibition of arousal. So oftentimes it's more psychogenic, meaning it's psychological and not necessarily physical. Now, some men who are on some medications, especially for heart things or blood pressure and stuff like that, that can have a side effect of erectile dysfunction. But oftentimes it's just kind of like a thing that happens, and because their partner expects different behavior from their erection, or they get freaked out by their loss of an erection, then it causes that fear and panic, and then that can make it harder for them the next time to perform. Women can also have arousal disorders, and it's more common, but it's usually very temporary. They will oftentimes lack sufficient sexual stimulation before lovemaking, which makes them just uninterested. It can be a side effect of medications such as contraceptives. Could be anxiety or anger towards one's partner, depression, stress, and worries. And it can also be childhood experiences. So having childhood molestation, a harsh religious background, and an unloving childhood relationship can make arousal very difficult. And I want to jump back into like the religious background. And often many religions highly discourage women from behaving or thinking about arousal or sexuality. But then when they are in a partnership that's allowed, like a marriage, then they can essentially turn on that aspect of themselves. But if they've been told for most of their lives that it is sinful or harmful or somehow immoral to be sexual, it can be hard to kind of balance those competing ideas when it comes to actually engaging in sexual behaviors with their partner. And that can be a long-lasting impact. And oftentimes, they have to seek out therapy to kind of resolve some of these issues that develop from very strict religious backgrounds. Some individuals have an orgasm disorder. That's when the person fails to reach an orgasm during sexual activity, or they reach it too soon or too late. But that's oftentimes based on the individual or the couple's expectations for what is considered too soon or too late. For female orgasmic disorder, that's a persistent inability to reach orgasm. These individuals are not unresponsive. It's not that they're not enjoying themselves, but they just may not be able to achieve orgasm. This could be due to inadequate stimulation or faulty technique on behalf of their partners, and oftentimes communication can help resolve that. For men, we see a delayed ejaculation. This can be a persistent delay or absence of orgasm for men. This can be due to, again, strict religious training, fear of impregnating their partner, a lack of interest, previous trauma, or unacknowledged homosexuality. So if they're not, sexually interested in their partner, but they think they are, then obviously that can be very problematic. We also see with men premature or early ejaculation. So this occurs reflexively when a man cannot tolerate the high levels of excitement at the plateau stage, and, things go too quickly for them. It's considered premature when it occurs before the man or his partner want it to occur. But this is really common and can be treated just through, basic behavioral differences. So oftentimes young men have problems with premature ejaculation just because the excitement gets to be too much. So different treatment, communication techniques, what they call the start-stop technique. There's a few more techniques that are listed in the book that I think you guys would find really useful. And so it's just essentially communication with the partner, kind of slowing down when that excitement gets to be too high. We also see sexual pain disorders. There's what's called genitopelvic pain or penetration disorder. This is when women experience sexual pain. And it's going to involve what's called dyspareunia, which is genital pain before, during, or after sexual intercourse. And it's usually accompanied by a condition called vaginismus, when the muscles in the vagina spasm in a very painful way. This can obviously create fear of intercourse if having intercourse becomes very painful. It can be caused by previous painful intercourse, rape, brutal or frightening sexual encounters, a fear of men, having misinformation about sex, fear of pregnancy, etc. There are different treatments that are advised, which is progressive muscle relaxation, so breathing techniques, kind of relaxing the whole body, learning how to manually stimulate oneself, hypnosis. They even use a series of dilators, essentially very thin tubes that are inserted that they then kind of go progressively larger over time until they can handle like a normal penis size dilator. And then that way they can kind of overcome this. This actually shows up in the Netflix show Unorthodox, where you see this, the young woman in the show, she has vaginismus. And you know, she's her I guess friend tries to kind of help her overcome it. But I think it's an interesting portrayal of this disorder because it is common, but not common enough that it's well discussed. We also have what are called paraphilic disorders. These are compulsive or destructive deviations in sexual preferences or behaviors. Some of them are legal and some of them are illegal, or some of them are legal just based off the context. So one of the disorders listed here is fetishistic, which is having sexual arousal from inanimate objects. These are like the people you see on like My Strange Addiction who are in love with their car or airplanes or, you know, sex dolls, things like that. You know, you see some of this on TV or online. Even like Snapchat stories sometimes will have things about this. Transvestic, which is wearing clothing of the opposite sex. So, you know, stereotypically men wearing, you know, female clothing or underwear. This is not the same thing as transgender. They used to, you know, transvestites and transgender individuals used to be kind of lumped in the same category, but it's not. People who are transvestic, they have no problem with their gender identity. It's just they happen to find sexual arousal in wearing the clothing of an opposite sex individual. Then we have sexual masochism, which is receiving pain or humiliation as part of the sexual act. That's usually paired with sexual sadism, which is inflicting pain or humiliation as part of the sex act. This is, again, usually done within a consensual partnership, and usually have one person who is dominating the other person. The sadist usually will dominate then the masochist, and they both find pleasure in that act. So you hear like BDSM, that's what we're talking about. So it's not, you know, it's not an illegal thing. They're doing this as part of an open communication relationship. We have frotteurism, which is sexually rubbing or touching a non-consenting person in public. This is obviously illegal. Exhibitionistic is flashing or displaying genitals to unwilling viewers. Now, this is generally illegal, obviously, if the person is unwilling, they're non-consenting. However, some people, you know, they like to record themselves having a sexual act, and that can be exhibitionistic without being illegal, as long as the people who might be viewing it, you know, are consenting to it. And then pedophilic is people who find sexual arousal from touching children or having sex with children, child molestation. This is obviously very highly illegal. So we talk about pedophilic disorder. I know this can be difficult to talk about, but it's important to understand. So most people who molest children are male, married fathers, and they are usually rigid and or passive or puritanical in their belief system or behaviors. Molestation will rarely exceed fondling, although it can. Most abusers act alone unless they're part of a, you know, higher structure that kind of allows them to get away with it. And so think of, you know, the typical like Catholic Church issues that happened, you know, in the past, or, you know, what happened with the, you know, Penn State Sandusky trial. It's not that people didn't know what was going on. It's just those individuals are in places of power where they were kind of protected from the repercussions of their actions. It wasn't like other people that were joining in on the sexual acts. Most abusers target children by first offering them gifts and then use threats to gain continued compliance. So they're not usually looking for children who are very secure from happy households. They usually seek out children who they kind of know are a little lost in the system or in their families. They'll offer them small gifts and say, hey, this is just between you and I. Don't tell your parents. And then they will kind of continue to increase their kind of exploitation and like that trust building relationship between them and the child. and then they can move on to molestation and sexual acts. So signs of molestation in a child are unusual avoidance or interest in sexual matters, secretiveness, nightmares, misbehavior, such as unusual risk-taking, emotional disturbance, and loss of self-esteem. So the impacts and duration of the impacts on the molested person depend on the duration of the abuse and whether genital sexual acts were involved. Also, men and boys are much less likely to come forward when they're abused because of, the ideas of masculinity and being able to protect oneself and, are you really a man if you were abused? Obviously, those types of kind of stereotypes can be very harmful for boys who are abused. Children should be taught to not keep secrets from their families. Again, things like gift giving and things like that, even within one's household. So, dad shouldn't take the kids for ice cream and say, okay, don't tell your mother, this is our secret. Because once kids learn to keep secrets from parents, then that can be kind of exploited by abusers. Children should also be taught to shout no if an adult tries to engage them in sexual activity. It's also important for children to know the correct terminology when talking about their genitalia. So, if parents use, silly words to talk about their body parts. So let's say, a family calls the daughter's vulva a cookie. Well, and she goes to her teacher and says, my uncle touched my cookie. And people are going to be like, okay, whatever. They're not going to understand it. Now she says, my uncle touched my vulva. Then a teacher is going to be alerted and will take the appropriate actions to protect that child. So it's important that children actually know the correct language to talk about their genitalia. And then we're going to talk about sexually transmitted diseases, also known as STIs, sexually transmitted infections. There are a whole bunch of these. They used to be called venereal diseases or VDs. So the terminology has kind of changed over time. So disease kind of sounds like permanent and very negative versus an infection. Everyone gets infections at different times, whether it's an ear infection or strep throat infections, things like that. So the terminology has kind of shifted even in the last few years. So there's chlamydia, gonorrhea, hepatitis B, genital herpes, syphilis, HPV, which is human papillomavirus, PID, pelvic inflammatory disease, HIV, which is human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS, which is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So HIV is kind of the more passive form of the virus, and then AIDS is the actual illness that comes from the HIV virus. Some of these, chlamydia, gonorrhea, they're bacterial. All you have to do is get an injection of an antibiotic, and you're good to go. You are cured. But things like herpes, kind of sticks around forever. There are treatments to kind of keep the symptoms down. HPV, that typically kind of resolves on its own, but there's over 100 different types of HPV, and some of them can cause cancer, especially in women. So cervical cancer can be caused by the HPV virus. So that's where vaccines like Gardasil come into play, where that will actually keep the woman or the individual from getting HPV in the first place and keeps them safe from cervical cancer. So some risk factors for STDs are having unprotected sex with an infected individual, of course, having 2 or more sexual partners, sharing needles or syringes. Anytime you're sharing instruments that touch blood can be problematic, having sex with someone who injects drugs, and HIV infections are only spread through direct contact with body fluid, blood, semen, and vaginal secretions, not through casual contact. So you're not going to give someone a high five or give someone a kiss and get HIV. It's through these very direct bodily fluids. So it's not in saliva at a detectable rate. A lot of these STIs are what we consider to be asymptomatic diseases. So that's when the person has a disease, but they don't have any obvious symptoms. So the most common symptom of an STI is having no symptoms at all. And the symptoms that do occur are usually, thought of as being something else. Just, that's ingrown hair, or I just have some pelvic discomfort. Maybe it's my period. So STIs should be screened for annually at checkups or between sexual partners. So we're going to kind of end at this section talking about rape, which is, I know it's an unfortunate thing to talk about, but I think it's also very important. So 20% of American women are victims of attempted rape or are raped at some point in their lifetimes. And half of those victims are through acquaintance rape, meaning that they know the person who actually committed the rape. There are different types of rape. So we think of typically is of forcible rape, which is when sexual intercourse is carried out against the victim's will under threat of violence or injury. It's not like a sexual thing typically. It's not the person just overwhelmed with desire and they can't help themselves. It's an act of brutality. It's a power differential. It's not because the person just saw, a man saw a girl and she was just too beautiful and he couldn't stop himself. It's an act of power and debasement of others. And there's also acquaintance or date rape. This is forced intercourse that occurs in the context of a date or other voluntary encounter. So that, the people know each other, they're hanging out at a party, he offers to bring her home, and then maybe, she's been drinking too much and, isn't able to stop him from having a sexual intercourse act occur. So there are a lot of rape myths. There are false beliefs about rape that blame the victim and increase the likelihood that men will think that a rape is justified. It's unfortunate because no rape is justified. No means no. But also besides that, everyone should be giving very enthusiastic consent, not just an absence of a no, but it should be the presence of a very enthusiastic yes at each stage of the sexual act. So if you're interested, please check out this link here. This is the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale. So there's a bunch of rape myths, and you can kind of see where you yourself and maybe your friends kind of fall on how they view these different rape ideas and rape myths. So here's some very common rape myths that are available to us right here, though. So a woman who appears alone in public and dresses provocatively or attractively is asking for it. Obviously, this is a myth because no woman is asking for being raped. A woman could be completely naked walking down the middle of the street in the middle of the night around a bunch of drunk people, and she's still not asking to be raped. Another myth is when a woman says no, she really means yes. And obviously that is incorrect. Many women who are raped actually enjoy it. No. A rape is, non-consensual. That is the whole point. If a woman goes home with a man on a first date, she's interested in sex. No. Maybe they're trying to get to know that man first, or maybe at first she was interested in sex but then changes her mind. That is still considered to be rape, even if she was initially interested. If a woman is sexually active, she is probably lying if she says she was raped. Obviously, rape can happen in any context, in any relationship, at any time. Rape can even happen in a marriage. Husbands can rape their wives and vice versa. So there's a really interesting video, I'm sure many of you have seen it, about tea and consent. That's available on the playlist for you guys to watch. I hope you guys check that out because it is excellent and it really explains consent very well. So I want you guys also to think, how you protect yourselves from rape or sexual assault in general. When I ask this to men in my class, typically they're like, don't walk down dark alleys alone drunk. Or especially in foreign countries, you got to be careful, or don't go to prison, really basic things like that. When you ask women, and I hope men, listening to this, I hope if you have women in your life, ask your female friends or ask your sisters or ask your mothers, how do they protect themselves from sexual assault? The list is endless, from the way that they walk with keys between their fingers, or they'll call someone on the phone and talk to them until they get home safely, where they park, where they won't park, how they walk, what times of the day they feel like they can walk, how they wear their hair, wearing earbuds or not wearing earbuds, or listening to music, not listening to music. Every aspect of how women move through the public world is shaped by them trying to avoid sexual assault. And men just don't have that same sense instilled to them from young children because of the disparity in sexual assault rapes between men and women. So men, I hope you can appreciate kind of what girls go through in order to avoid sexual assault. And then also, keep an protective eye on your female friends, and also just don't be a creep, because understand that women are uncomfortable with the presence of unknown men out in public, because there is a chance that every man out there could be dangerous. All right. So on that very pleasant note, we're going to wrap up this chapter. If you have any questions, please email me. I'm happy to answer them, or we'll talk in our meetings. Thank you so much. Goodbye.